The nursing home was quiet, too quiet, tucked away behind a row of dying trees and peeling paint. It was the kind of place people went to be forgotten. Room 108 had no visitors, no family photos, no birthday cards taped to the wall. Just Walter, Leland, an old man with tired eyes and a silence that felt heavier than age. To the staff, he was just another resident, polite, distant, fading. No one asked questions. No one knew his past. But what no one imagined was that Walter held a secret. Not just any secret, a $5 million fortune hidden away, untouched, unspoken. And even more shocking than the money was who he chose to leave it to, because sometimes those the world forgets. Remember everything, every wound, every betrayal, and every person who showed them a reason to believe. Again, enjoy the story. The nursing home stood like a forgotten monument at the edge of town, its bricks cracked by time, its paint dulled by weather and memory. Inside, the days bled together under the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft clatter of walkers on linoleum. In room 108, Walter Leland sat beneath a window whose blinds were always slightly open, as if even the sky above had stopped trying to see him. He wasn't like the other residents who clung to photo albums or waited for the rare Sunday visit. Walter didn't have visitors, no phone calls, no names scribbled on the whiteboard calendar by his bed, just silence, and he wore it well. Not with bitterness, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had made peace with being invisible. To the nurses, he was gentle and predictable, always saying please and thank you, always folding his blanket at the same corner, always watching the garden as if something might grow there again. What they didn't know, what no one even guessed, was that Walter wasn't waiting for death. He was waiting for something much more precise. Every day, at exactly 4:03 p.m., he would turn his head to the door. Not early, not late, as if expecting someone to walk through it. Someone who never did. And yet he kept waiting. Most assumed it was a habit of dementia, a symptom of confusion. But Walter's mind was sharp, sharper than anyone realized. He remembered every face he had ever loved, every betrayal, every promise made and broken. The nurses came and went, unaware that the man they helped bathe, feed, and medicate had once signed million-dollar contracts, had once stood before boardrooms in tailored suits, had once built something that mattered, and when it all collapsed, it didn't end in fire. It ended here, in quiet resignation, in a place where his name was reduced to a wristband, and his story was just another file. But the truth was still alive inside him, hidden, protected, measured like an inheritance no one knew existed. Beneath his bed was a locked leather case no one ever touched. Inside it, papers, documents, and one single photo, a little girl with curly hair and eyes that matched his wife's. She couldn't have been more than 7 when the photo was taken. And on the back, a name, Eliza-1999. No one at the home had ever heard the name. No one knew what she meant to him. But Walter knew. Every day, he looked at that photo before he went to bed. And every morning, he folded it back into the case, locked it, and placed it beneath his mattress again. Because he hadn't forgotten her. He had been waiting not for peace, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to give her something no one else ever had, the truth, and the legacy she never knew was hers. The staff rarely questioned Walter's routines. After all, in a place where most residents faded into their own timelines, a quiet old man who caused no trouble was a blessing. But there was one person who noticed more than the others. Maria, a young aide working the evening shift. She was new, still fresh with compassion that hadn't yet been dulled by repetition. Something about Walter intrigued her, not out of pity, but curiosity. He didn't mumble to himself like the others. He didn't forget names or mistake her for someone else. He was alert to alert. He watched everything, listened closely, responded thoughtfully, and that made her wonder, why would someone like him end up here, alone, discarded like a broken appliance no longer needed? She started paying more attention, noticing the way he traced his finger along the same fold of the curtain each day. The way his eyes lit up barely, but enough whenever someone mentioned the word family. She sensed there was more behind that polite smile and calm voice, something unfinished. One night, during her last rounds, Maria found Walter asleep, the room dim but not dark. A gentle breeze slipped in through the cracked window, rustling the papers on his nightstand. One had fallen to the floor. She reached to pick it up, not snooping, just helping, but what she saw stopped her cold. It wasn't a document. It was a photograph a faded image of a little girl holding a yellow balloon, standing beside a woman with a blurred face. On the back, "For Eliza, always, Grandpa." Maria's breath caught. Grandpa. The word struck her like a bolt. He had family. Someone, somewhere. Someone he never spoke about. She placed the photo carefully back on the nightstand and tucked the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Her shift ended, but her thoughts didn't. The next day, she asked Walter gently if he had any family. He paused, then shook his head softly. "Not anymore," he said. But Maria saw something flicker in his eyes, a crack in the mask. It wasn't denial. It was protection. Walter hadn't forgotten Eliza. He had hidden her, not out of shame or anger, but for reasons only he understood. That photo had survived more than 2 decades. Its edges were worn, but the ink was still bold. For Eliza, always. That wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise. And Maria could feel it in her bones. There was a story buried beneath that quiet man's silence, one that had never been told. Something about that child, that name, that expression in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't the look of a man waiting to die. It was the look of a man waiting for something to be set right. And Maria, though she didn't know it yet, had just stepped into a story that would change not only Walter's final days, but her own life forever. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. In a place where most stories had already been told, Walter's remained locked away, and that made her restless. Over the following weeks, she paid closer attention, looking for fragments of truth in his small habits. Every detail mattered now. How he always kept his nightstand drawer shut tight, how he folded his clothes with military precision, how he refused to let anyone else make his bed. These weren't signs of senility. They were traces of discipline, of a life that had once demanded control. And then there was the lockbox. She noticed it during routine cleaning, partially hidden beneath the mattress. It looked old but sturdy, with a 3-digit combination lock and worn leather edges that had clearly traveled through time. She didn't dare touch it, but it burned into her memory. Whatever was inside, Walter was guarding it like a soldier protecting his final post. She didn't need to open it to know it held answers. The question was, answers to what? Late one afternoon, while assisting Walter with his medication, Maria took a risk. She sat. The following week brought rain, thick, unrelenting, and cold. It tapped against the nursing home windows like a reminder that time was always moving, even when lives inside those walls felt frozen. Walter's health began to shift. Nothing dramatic, but subtle enough for Maria to notice. He seemed more tired, his voice thinner, his pauses between thoughts longer. Something inside him was winding down, and Maria felt it like a pulse beneath the surface. One evening, after helping him settle into bed, she lingered by the door. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," she offered. Walter stared at the ceiling for a moment, then turned to her. "Do you believe in redemption, Maria?" She hesitated, not out of disbelief, but out of surprise. "I think everyone deserves it," she replied. He closed his eyes. "Then maybe I'm not too late." Those words hung in the air long after she had left the room, haunting her with their weight. The next day, Maria found an envelope tucked under her clipboard. No name, no note, just a key inside, small, silver, and cold to the touch. She knew instantly what it belonged to. Heart pounding, she returned to Walter's room during lunch rounds and opened the lockbox beneath his bed. Inside were papers, dozens of them, legal documents, handwritten letters, photographs, and most shocking of all, a notarized last will and testament. The recipient, Eliza May Leland, beneficiary of an account totaling $5 million. Maria's knees nearly gave out. $5 million sitting in the shadows of a nursing home room. The revelation was staggering. But what struck her more than the amount was the clarity of intent. Walter had prepared everything. He had left instructions, dates, contacts, even a letter addressed to whoever finds this. It was more than a secret, it was a mission, one he could no longer complete on his own. Maria's hands trembled as she read the letter. "If you're reading this," it began, "then it means I've finally trusted someone again. Thank you. Her name is Eliza. She's my granddaughter. I don't know where she is now, but I've spent years trying to make peace with the fact that I failed her. Not because I didn't love her, but because I thought leaving was the best way to protect her. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I wasn't. But this is what I can give her now. If you can find her, if you can tell her who she is, what she means to me, then maybe all of this wasn't for nothing." Maria clutched the letter to her chest. She had entered this building looking for a job. She never expected to be chosen to carry someone's final hope. But now, she knew there was no turning back. Walter had trusted her with a legacy, and she was going to honor it, no matter what it cost. Maria didn't sleep that night. Her mind reeled with questions, possibilities, and the pressure of what she now carried. She read and reread every document from the lockbox, trying to stitch together the past from the fragments Walter had left behind. There were court papers from over 2 decades ago, a custody dispute, restraining orders, financial settlements. There was a photo of a young woman Maria assumed to be Walter's daughter, with eyes just like his, holding a toddler that had to be Eliza. And there was a final letter, yellowed by time, folded so many times it threatened to tear at the creases. In it, Walter wrote of a falling out, of decisions made out of fear, of a promise to step away so his family wouldn't be destroyed by the same mistakes he had once made. It wasn't abandonment, it was exile, self-imposed. He had chosen to disappear and live in silence. But silence had never been peace, it had been torment. And now, through Maria, he was trying to make the noise of truth heard again. She returned to the nursing home the next morning with purpose. Walter was already awake, sitting at the window in his usual posture. But something was different. His eyes weren't staring into the distance, they were waiting for her. She sat down beside him and placed the key on the table between them. "I found everything," she said softly. Walter nodded once, slowly. "Then you know why I stayed." Quiet. Maria swallowed hard. "She deserves to know. You deserve to be remembered for more than this room." Walter closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. "I was afraid that if I reached out, I'd ruin her life, that I'd bring shame, or pain, or worse, hope." His voice cracked, the years of restraint collapsing under the weight of regret. "But I see now, the real mistake wasn't walking away. It was thinking I had no right to return." Maria took his hand. "You still have time, Walter. We can find her. We can try." The idea of trying lit something in him. Not bright, just enough to warm the cold he had wrapped himself in. For the next few days, Maria and Walter worked quietly together, going through every piece of the puzzle. She started searching online, old addresses, archived school records, social media. But the trail was old, and time had buried many of its clues. Still, Maria refused to give up. Walter's condition, however, began to worsen. His energy drained faster, his appetite faded. The nurses noticed, but Maria knew what they didn't. This wasn't just age, this was urgency. His body was letting go, even as his heart clung to one last hope. Every evening, she read to him, from the letters he had written to Eliza, words he had never dared to send, apologies, memories, birthday wishes that were never spoken. And as she read, Walter would close his eyes, and for a few minutes each night, he looked like a man who wasn't dying, but remembering how to live. It was during one of those evenings, while reading aloud from a letter dated over a decade ago, that Maria noticed Walter's breathing slow into a steadier rhythm, not weak, but focused. He opened his eyes before she finished and whispered, "Do you think she'd even care to know?" Maria set the letter down and looked at him with unwavering certainty. "I think she deserves the choice, and you deserve the chance." That night, Walter gave her one final envelope, unsealed, handwritten, with Eliza's full name across the front. "If you find her, give her this, not before." Maria tucked it into her bag as if it were made of glass. It wasn't just paper, it was a man's last attempt to reach the only person who could redeem his memory. And something about that envelope made her feel as though she'd been handed a torch that couldn't be dropped, even if it burned her along the way. She couldn't explain it, she just knew. 3 days later, Walter didn't come to breakfast. When the morning nurse went to check on him, his bed was still made, his room in perfect order, as if he had prepared for his own absence. He was sitting in his chair by the window, eyes closed, lips parted slightly in a soft, serene expression. His hand was resting gently over his chest, holding the last photo of Eliza. He had passed in the night, not with panic or pain, but with the quiet dignity he had carried his entire life. No alarms, no final words, just the soft end of a long silence. Maria was called immediately. She didn't cry when she saw him. She sat by his side, placed a hand over his, and whispered, "I'll find her, I swear." And in that moment, she knew what came next wasn't grief, it was responsibility. Walter hadn't just left her a task, He had trusted her with a truth powerful enough to rewrite the ending of a forgotten man's story. Walter's will was clear. Every cent of the $5 million was to be transferred to Eliza May Leland upon confirmation of her identity. If she could not be found within 3 years of his death, the money would go to a children's literacy foundation in his late wife's name. There was no backup heir, no legal tricks. It was all for Eliza, or for a cause close to his heart. Maria spent the next days handling the paperwork, coordinating with the attorney Walter had arranged years before. No one questioned her role. Walter had already ensured it. In the folder she submitted was a handwritten note from him stating, "Maria Gonzalez is to be treated as my personal representative. She is the only one I trust to carry this through." The lawyer raised an eyebrow when he read it, then nodded respectfully. "You must have meant a lot to him." Maria smiled, the kind of smile that carries sorrow and pride in equal measure. "No," she said softly, "he meant a lot to me." Weeks turned into months. Maria continued her search for Eliza with tireless resolve, chasing leads that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. Every phone call that went unanswered, every email that bounced back, every record that led to a dead end, it all weighed on her, but she refused to quit. She searched through high school alumni lists, online genealogy sites, even public adoption and court records. Walter hadn't left her a roadmap, just fragments, memories, and a name. But Maria had something stronger than directions. She had purpose, and that made all the difference. Late one evening, just as she was about to close her laptop after another long day of nothing, she noticed a comment thread buried in a public forum. A user had posted under the name Leland, responding to an old article about generational wealth and lost inheritance. The comment was simple: "Sometimes the ones who vanish are the ones who are protecting you." Maria froze. It wasn't proof. It wasn't a smoking gun. But something about that sentence, the phrasing, the tone, the username, hit her like a lightning strike. She followed the trail. The user had an account tied to an art school portfolio. From there, a gallery listing, a physical address, Brooklyn, New York. Maria stared at the screen, heart pounding. It had to be her. She printed everything she could find, booked a cheap flight using her savings, and packed only what she needed: Walter's letter, the envelope, and her determination. When she arrived at the art studio, it was smaller than she imagined, tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore, with peeling paint on the doorframe. Inside, the walls were covered in soft pastels and charcoal portraits. In the center was a woman, mid-20s, curly dark hair, strong eyes that instantly reminded Maria of Walter. She was adjusting a canvas when she turned and noticed Maria. There was a silence, a long, loaded pause. Maria stepped forward, careful not to say too much too soon. "Are you Eliza Leland?" The woman nodded cautiously. "Yes, can I help you?" Maria took a deep breath, pulled the envelope from her coat pocket, and held it out with both hands. "I knew your grandfather." Eliza stared at the envelope like it was radioactive. "He's dead." Maria nodded slowly. "But before he died, he wanted you to have this. He left something behind, not just money. A story. A truth he never got to tell you." Eliza hesitated, then took the envelope with trembling fingers. She opened it slowly, unfolding the letter inside. As her eyes scanned the page, her lips parted in disbelief. Her expression shifted: confusion, sadness, then something else. A quiet recognition. "I thought he left us because he didn't care," she whispered. Maria shook her head. "He left because he did." And in that moment, Walter's silence was finally broken, not with words, but with understanding. Tears welled up in Eliza's eyes as she held the letter to her chest like it was something sacred, something stolen by time and finally returned. She sat down slowly on a paint-splattered bench, her hands trembling as they gripped the paper. Maria stayed quiet. This wasn't her moment, it was Walter's, a moment 30 years in the making. When Eliza finally spoke, her voice was raw. "I grew up hearing that he abandoned us. My mum never forgave him. She said he was cold, selfish, ruthless in business, and worse as a father." She paused, eyes lost in the letter again. "But this doesn't sound like a selfish man." Maria sat beside her. "He wasn't. He made mistakes. Yes, big ones. But he never stopped thinking about you. Every day in that nursing home, he stared out the window like he was waiting for someone who never came. And when I asked who he was waiting for, he just said, 'You'd know her if you saw her smile.'" Eliza let out a quiet laugh. shaking her head in disbelief. He remembered my smile. Maria nodded. He remembered everything, and he left everything to you. She pulled out a copy of the will and placed it gently in Eliza's hands. As Eliza read the document, her breath caught. $5 million, she whispered. He left me $5 million. But the shock wasn't greed, it was grief. She hadn't lost a distant, irrelevant man. She had lost someone who had carried her in his heart every single day. And now that she knew, it was too late to tell him that she would have forgiven him, that she had grown up wondering about him, that sometimes, when life got hard, she used to dream that maybe, just maybe, her grandfather was still out there, watching over her. He thought he ruined your life, Maria said gently, so he stayed away. But this, everything he left, you, it was his way of trying to make it right. Eliza wiped her face, lips trembling. It's not the money, she whispered. It's the fact that someone loved me that much, and I never even knew. They sat there for a long time, the air between them heavy with everything that could have been, and everything that still might be. Eliza finally stood and walked toward a canvas, her hands hovering over it, unsure. He missed every birthday, every graduation, every moment. But somehow, this feels more real than any of that. Maria smiled softly. Sometimes love isn't loud, it waits, even in silence. Eliza turned back to her, her face no longer just sad, but determined. I want to know everything. Everything he told you, everything he remembered. Maria nodded. Then let's begin. And in that quiet Brooklyn studio, with the smell of paint and forgotten history hanging in the air, the legacy of a man once discarded in a lonely room began to breathe again, not through headlines or inheritance lawyers, but through the heart of the one person he'd never stopped loving, and the woman he trusted to carry his story home. The days that followed felt like a resurrection. Eliza cleared her calendar, cancelled exhibitions, and carved out hours each evening to meet with Maria. They would sit in the back corner of the studio, two women from completely different worlds, bound by the quiet heartbeat of a man who had once believed his legacy would vanish with him. Maria brought everything Walter had left behind: the letters, the old photographs, the business documents, even a cassette tape he had recorded years ago and hidden in a folder labeled for her. Months passed, but the story didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder, not through gossip or headlines, but through whispers that reached people's hearts. Inheritance of Silence became more than an art exhibition. It became a movement. Eliza began receiving letters from strangers, people who had been abandoned, people who had walked away, people who had never been told the full truth about their families. They saw Walter in their fathers, in their mothers, in themselves. The studio became a sanctuary. Eliza kept a notebook by the entrance where visitors could write messages. One entry read, "Thank you for showing me that silence doesn't always mean absence." Another said, "My dad never said he loved me, but maybe he was just afraid." Like yours, Eliza would read these notes every night, and each time she did, she felt a little closer to the man who had once believed he had nothing left to give. And then came the letter, the one that changed everything. It arrived in a cream envelope, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a photograph of Eliza as a baby, held in the arms of a man she barely recognized, but somehow knew. On the back, "I took this the last day I saw you. I've carried it in my wallet for 25 years. Alongside it was a short message. "I was wrong to keep you from him. He was a better man than I ever admitted. Thank you for proving it." There was no signature. But Eliza knew who had written it. Her mother. It was the apology she never thought she'd receive. A small olive branch from a woman hardened by grief, now softened by the undeniable weight of truth. Eliza pressed the letter to her heart and whispered, "I forgive you," not out of obligation, but out of understanding, because now she knew how deeply silence could lie, and how love could still grow from its ashes. Maria visited less frequently now, but their bond had only grown deeper. They spoke weekly, often laughing about Walter's dry sense of humor or the strange way fate had stitched their lives together. One afternoon, as they shared tea in the studio, Maria looked around at the dozens of sketches pinned to the walls. "He left more than a fortune," she said. "He left a legacy." Eliza nodded. "And it's still growing." She walked over to a large canvas draped in cloth, pulled it down, and revealed a new piece, a portrait of Walter not as the man in room 108, but as he might have looked in life: confident, kind, strong, whole. At the bottom, in soft white paint, the words, "He wasn't forgotten, He was waiting, and now, he wasn't waiting anymore. His story had found its ending, not in the silence of an empty nursing home, but in the hearts of those brave enough to listen. That winter, on the anniversary of Walter's passing, Eliza organized something she never thought she'd have the strength to do: a memorial. Not a funeral, not a formal service, but a celebration of the man behind the silence. It was held at the studio, transformed for one night into a living archive of Walter's memory. The centerpiece was his favorite chair, the very one he had spent his final years in, transported from room 108, and placed beneath a single hanging light. Surrounding it were photos from his youth, restored and reprinted, showing him smiling beside his wife, standing in front of the company he once built, and holding a toddler in a yellow dress, the same dress from the photo he had kept under his bed. Music played gently in the background, a selection of old jazz tunes Maria had discovered on a cassette Walter kept hidden. Guests came from all walks of life: neighbors, artists, former colleagues who had heard the story and wanted to pay respects to a man they had once misunderstood or forgotten altogether. Maria stood quietly near the window, watching as people paused before the chair and the exhibit, many wiping away tears, others simply silent. Eliza approached her, holding 2 cups of tea. "He would have hated this," she joked. "All this attention." Maria chuckled. "Probably, but deep down, I think he'd be proud. You gave him back his name." Eliza nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "And you gave me a grandfather." The 2 women stood side by side, not as nurse and heir, but as family born through fate. Later that evening, Eliza took the microphone and spoke to the gathered room. She didn't read a speech, she spoke from her heart. Walter Leland wasn't perfect. He made choices, some that hurt, some that healed. But the most important thing he ever did was try to make it right. Not with money, not with excuses, but with the truth. And that truth changed me. She paused, scanning the crowd. He didn't die forgotten. He died waiting, and I came. Applause wasn't expected, but it came slow, sincere, and swelling. Not for the art, not for the inheritance, but for the redemption of a man whose story had nearly ended in silence. That night, Eliza, now in her early 40s, stood on the stage of a packed auditorium. She wore a simple black blazer, her hair tied back, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the microphone. The crowd had gathered for the 10th anniversary of Letters from 108, and for the unveiling of a new exhibit titled Echoes of the Forgotten. Behind her, projected onto a massive screen, was the image of Walter, not the frail man from room 108, but the young father in one of his earlier photos, smiling in front of a modest home. Eliza began to speak. "My grandfather once said, if you're reading this, it means I've finally trusted someone again. That someone was Maria, and because of her, I got to meet the version of him that no one else knew. The version that never gave up. He just went quiet. And through that quiet, he left behind something powerful. Not money, not just legacy, but a mirror, one that forces us all to ask, who are we when no one's looking? And what truths are we willing to leave behind when we're gone?" The room was silent as she paused, collecting herself. We often say, it's never too late to change, but sometimes, we don't get to change, we just get one final chance to be understood. Walter took that chance. He trusted a stranger, he wrote the truth, and in doing so, he rewrote everything we thought we knew about silence, about family, about forgiveness. She stepped back as the crowd rose in quiet applause, not thunderous, but steady, the kind of applause that comes from people who have felt something shift inside them. As she left the stage, Maria was waiting in the wings. Now older, wiser, her eyes still carried that same spark, the spark of someone who once chose to listen when no one else did. They embraced without speaking. Because some stories don't need to be told again to be felt. Some stories, like Walter's, simply live on in the brushstrokes of a painting, the lines of a letter, or the heart of someone brave enough to carry the silence forward. After the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Eliza walked alone through the quiet corridors of the gallery. The night had been perfect, moving, honest, healing, but there was a weight still resting on her shoulders. The weight of finality, of knowing that a chapter long in the making was, at last, closing. She stopped in front of the very first portrait she'd ever painted of Walter, the one where he sat alone in his nursing home chair, facing an open doorway filled with light. She traced the edges of the frame with her fingers, remembering how scared she had been to paint it. Back then, she didn't yet know the man behind those weary eyes. She only knew that he had waited. And now, after everything, the letters, the studio, the movement, she finally understood what he had been waiting for. Not redemption, not legacy, but connection. One single thread to pull him back into the fabric of the world he thought had moved on without him. Maria joined her a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of tea just like they used to. No words passed between them at first. They just stood together, the way they had so many times over the years in hospitals, courtrooms, studios, and quiet parks. He would have been proud. Maria finally said. Eliza smiled, eyes still on the painting. I hope so. I used to think I needed to become someone big, someone visible, to be worthy of what he left me. But now I know. He didn't leave it to me because of who I was. He left it to me because of who he hoped I'd become. Maria nodded slowly. And you became her. They sipped their tea in silence, the gallery echoing with the soft shuffle of closing staff, the hum of the evening winding down. Do you think stories ever really end? Eliza asked. Maria thought for a moment. No, I think they just wait for someone new to listen. That night, Eliza returned home to her quiet apartment, now filled with memories more than furniture. She opened her grandfather's original letter, the one she had read 100 times, but never aloud, and began recording a voiceover for an upcoming project. It was a documentary, based on his story, but meant for a wider audience, not to tell them about Walter, but to help them hear someone in their own lives they might be ignoring. As she finished the final sentence, she whispered, I hear you now, Grampy Walt. And in that moment, the silence that had once defined their relationship didn't vanish. It transformed. It became something holy, something full, something alive. Walter Leland had left behind more than money. He had left behind a quiet, echoing reminder that no one is ever truly forgotten, not if their story finds a heart brave enough to carry it. The screen faded to black, and across it, in white letters, a final tribute appeared. He waited in silence, and was met with love. In the years that followed, the Leland Project became a national initiative, integrated into elder care systems across the country. Nursing homes began shifting, not just in structure, but in spirit. Residents were no longer treated as fading archives, but as living stories, each with chapters still waiting to be read. Trained facilitators, inspired by Maria's early advocacy work, began interviewing seniors as part of legacy sessions, preserving their histories through audio, video, and written records. Walter's story had sparked a cultural shift, not through fame or spectacle, but through human truth. One man's hidden life had proven that even in the last, quietest room of the forgotten, there could be a spark strong enough to set hearts ablaze. Eliza watched all of this unfold, not with the pride of ownership, but with the humility of stewardship. Her grandfather's voice, once buried, had become the seed of a forest of voices, no longer afraid to be heard. On the 20th anniversary of Walter's passing, a statue was unveiled in a public square just outside the original nursing home where he had spent his final years. It wasn't grand or polished, just a simple bronze figure seated in a chair, head slightly turned as if listening for someone who hadn't arrived yet. At the base was a single inscription. He waited, and someone came. Eliza stood beside Maria at the unveiling, now both older, wiser, and undeniably changed by the man who had brought them together. Cameras clicked, reporters asked questions, but neither woman offered long speeches. They had already said what needed to be said, not through words, but through action, through art, through listening, through choosing, again and again, to carry forward a story that could have easily died in silence. That evening, Eliza returned to the studio, now expanded into a community center bearing the name the Leland House. Children painted in one room. Seniors wrote letters in another. On the wall hung Walter's original portrait, preserved behind glass. She walked up to it slowly, pressing her hand against the cool surface. I kept my promise, she whispered. Then, turning to a group of young volunteers prepping for an intergenerational storytelling session, she smiled and said, Come on, let's make some memories. As the room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the soft scratching of pens on paper, a new generation began writing their own endings, not out of fear, not out of loneliness, but out of love, passed down from a man who once thought he had lost everything, only to discover that his quietest choice would become his loudest legacy. In the quiet of that evening, as the Leland house emptied out and the rooms dimmed one by one, Eliza sat alone in the heart of the studio, the place where it all began. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside these walls, time felt like it moved differently. On her desk lay hundreds of handwritten letters from families around the world, stories sent in from strangers who had seen the documentary, read the book, or walked through the exhibits inspired by Walter's journey. A woman in Tokyo who had reconnected with her estranged father after 30 years, a teenage boy in Argentina who discovered his great-grandmother's journals and turned them into a podcast, a nurse from Montana who started interviewing her patients one by one, just to let them feel seen before they slipped away. Walter's story had become a lantern in dark places, and Eliza understood now, more than ever, that legacies weren't built by wealth, they were built by honesty, by vulnerability, and by the bravery to pass the truth along. As she reread one of the letters, her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. It was for the annual listening night, an event held at the Leland house, where young volunteers would sit silently across from residents, asking nothing, saying nothing, just listening as the elderly shared one story from their life that they'd never told before. The rule was simple: no interruptions, no corrections, just presence. The event had become a sacred ritual, and this year, Eliza had decided to participate not as founder, but as listener. When she arrived in the lounge the next evening, an elderly man was already seated across from her, his hands folded, his eyes full of wear. His name tag read, Thomas J. She nodded politely, and he began, his voice slow, fragile, but deliberate. No one ever asks you what you regret when you're old. They just assume you've made peace. But sometimes, regret is the last thing you feel. And if you're lucky, someone gives you a chance to say it out loud. Those words struck her in the chest like a memory. She didn't know Thomas, but she knew that pain, the regret, the hope. She had heard it before, in Walter's voice, in his silence, in the letter he left behind. And now, here it was again, echoing in another soul. As the hour passed, Thomas told her about a son he hadn't spoken to in 40 years, a love he had abandoned out of fear, a poem he had written and never shared. Eliza didn't say a word. She simply listened fully, gently, with all the space his truth needed to breathe. And when it ended, he looked at her and said, "I don't need to be remembered. I just didn't want to be erased." She took his hand and nodded. "You won't be." As she left that night, Eliza looked back at the room filled with storytellers and storybearers, a cathedral of the unseen. And somewhere deep inside, she felt it again, the quiet certainty that Walter had not waited in vain. His story had opened a door, and through it, the world kept walking in. The next morning, Eliza stood by the window of her apartment, coffee in hand, watching as the sun climbed slowly over the skyline. There was a peace in her chest now, not because everything had healed, but because what once felt like an unbearable silence had finally been translated into something meaningful. Her grandfather's face wasn't just a memory anymore. It had become a guidepost. His choices, his absence, even his failure to speak sooner, all of it had been woven into a new fabric, one stitched with honesty, reconciliation, and second chances. And now, in this season of her life, Eliza found herself wanting to do for others what Maria and Walter had done for her. Not save them, not fix them, just show up, with ears open and judgment suspended. Because that's where the real healing started, not in answers, but in presence. Later that week, as Eliza sorted through boxes of old archived materials for an anniversary exhibit, she found something she'd never seen before, a small, sealed envelope with her name in Walter's handwriting. It must have been tucked inside one of the journals Maria had saved from the nursing home, unnoticed until now. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside, a single note: "You changed the ending." That was all. 4 words, but they landed like a weight on her soul. She read them over and over again, whispering them like a mantra, because it was true, not just for Walter's story, but for herself, for Maria, for everyone who had ever believed it was too late to be seen, too late to be known, too late to be loved. She folded the note and placed it in her wallet, knowing she would carry it for the rest of her life. It was a reminder that sometimes the loudest declarations of love don't come in speeches or ceremonies. They come in the soft, trembling truth whispered between 2 generations brave enough to forgive. That night, she stood in front of a new canvas. It was blank, empty, waiting, just like Walter had once waited for her. She dipped her brush into soft gray paint and began with a single stroke, then another and another. She didn't know what the final painting would be, but she knew what it would represent. It would be about legacy, about silence, about the spaces between people, and the bridges we choose to build across them. And somewhere in that brushwork, Walter would be there. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as presence, real, steady, watching, just as he always had, from the window of room 108. And this time, he wouldn't be waiting in vain. Years later, when Eliza was invited to speak at an international summit on generational healing through storytelling, she didn't come with a PowerPoint, a lecture, or statistics. Instead, she walked on stage holding Walter's old photograph, the one from decades ago, with his quiet eyes and steady hands, and placed it on the podium in front of her. The crowd of thousands grew silent as she began. "This man," she said, "was once labeled forgotten. His name didn't trend. His voice never went viral. But his truth changed lives because someone listened." Her voice trembled but never broke. He didn't leave behind a business empire. He didn't write books or build monuments. What he left was more powerful than all of that. He left someone to carry his silence forward and transform it into something that could speak for others too afraid to speak for themselves. She paused, glancing at the photo, and the truth is, I didn't save him. He saved me, just by trusting me with his unfinished story. After the summit, as people lined up to speak with her, many didn't come with questions. They came with names of their own forgotten ones. A grandmother who had died alone, a father who never said I love you, a brother who vanished after war, each one looking for some thread, some mirror, some glimmer of possibility that their silence, too, might still be worth something. And Eliza told each one the same thing Walter had taught her, without ever needing to say it directly. They're still with you, not in what they left behind, but in what you choose to do with what you now know. Her words rippled outward, far beyond the walls of that auditorium, across languages, cultures, and borders. Walter's voice had gone global, carried by the very granddaughter he once thought he'd lost forever. In her final years, Eliza continued painting not for galleries or exhibitions, but for peace. Her final collection was titled The Ones Who Waited, and it featured nameless elders seated in chairs, staring into light, silence, or memory. It was never sold. She donated the full series to care homes around the world, with a plaque under each canvas that simply read, "Don't let them leave unheard." And when she passed, quietly, surrounded by family and friends, Maria, now retired, silver-haired and still sharp, sat by her side and whispered, "You did it, Eliza. You changed the ending." In that room, filled with soft light and the scent of old books and drying paint, the legacy of Walter Leland came full circle, not as a man defined by absence, but as a soul who waited in silence, and was finally met with love.